Academia is more than research output and publications. In this seminar series, we discuss the personal and social aspects of academic work that are not discussed enough. Welcome to Life in Academia.
Hello, and a special hello to our speaker, Edward A. Lee. Edward has been working on embedded software systems for 40 years now, and after detours through very big names such as Yale, MIT, Bell Labs, he eventually landed at Berkeley, where he is now a professor of the Graduate School in Engineering, in Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. His research is focused on very computer science topics that I myself am not sure, I just don't understand them, but they are cyber physical systems where he strives to make composable, secure and verifiable timing sensitive systems. And recently he actually branched out into a little bit more of philosophy of technology with his most recent books, Plato the Nerd and the Co-Evolution. As today's topic is going to be a very important one. I think that's why all of you joined today. This talk will expose the culture of the toxic culture of publication in computer science, where we have these highly selective journals dominating, conferences dominating over journals as the preferred output venues, where we have an overemphasis on novelty and a tendency to reject papers that are either too easily written because of obviousness or not pretty enough, because they are just not, they don't sound it. So combine that with this weird fetish we have regarding low acceptance rates, and then we have this beautiful cocktail of a culture that does not necessarily serve the community well. So Edward will discuss the possible modifications that to these practices that may help. And obviously I have a lot of thoughts on this and cannot wait to hear Edward's thoughts, insights, and have a lively discussion with him and everybody in this chat today. So everybody, please join me in welcoming Edward A. Lee.
Thank you, Grisel. I'm going to share my screen for just a brief period of time and then stop sharing and just open up just for a verbal discussion, because I couldn't find any graphical representations for things that I wanted to say. So let's just start by sharing my screen, and let's first, Grisel mentioned my background, and I put it all kind of on one slide, not to show off, but I wanted, while this background was showing with, you know, this pedigree, as she called it, to explain that, you know, over the last 3 years, I've hit a very frustrating spell where most of the papers that my group has written have been rejected repeatedly by many of the leading conferences. And so we're experiencing the same frustration that I think many of the other people in the community are feeling. And I think the fact that I have this much experience, I think, gives me some credibility in knowing that these are not bad papers that are getting rejected. They're in fact very good papers that are getting rejected. And so this has sort of stimulated me to start to take a sort of critical look at the culture that's happening. Now, I'm also a participant in this culture from both sides, because I have served on many program committees. I have organized quite a few conferences. And so to some degree, I'm at least partly to blame for the culture, as well as being an overall participant in it. So just to give you a little orientation, I am from Berkeley, which is over here on the map in California, but at the moment I'm in Toulouse in France. And so I'm in the same time zone with our hosts, and I have no idea what time zone the rest of you are in, but in any case, I thought it might be useful to put some geography into this Zoom world. So my area of research is, as Grisel mentioned, cyber physical systems, which is really about computers that are not first and foremost computers, They're the computers that are part of bigger systems that are interacting with the physical world. Some of my favorite examples are these Mars rovers, which are really phenomenal cyber-physical systems. And I think that the reason that I mention this is that this area is relatively new, and I would say, roughly 20 years old in academia. And when it was starting out 20 years ago, it was actually pretty easy to get papers accepted because mostly I was involved in organizing many of the conferences in the area. And the community was relatively small, but the field has matured and sort of joined a little bit more of the mainstream of computer science and adopted much of its culture, much to its detriment, in my opinion. Grisel mentioned that I have this philosophical side. I lead a sort of schizophrenic existence where I spend some of my time looking at technology and society and trying to understand how technology relates to society, how it influences society, and most recently, how it co-evolves with technology. And I think that this will become pertinent in several of the points that I'd like to discuss. So what stimulated this invitation was this blog that I wrote. And the way that this blog came about, I'll give you a little bit of the history, but I served on a program committee for one of the main conferences in my area. And I got extremely frustrated with the program committee because I found that many of the papers that I thought were really very good and would be very useful and informative to the community were getting rejected by the program committee. And I sort of lost my temper and resigned in protest and sent an open letter to the program committee about why I was resigning from the program committee. And it sort of forced me to articulate what was bothering me about the whole culture. And then my sort of open letter started circulating among a whole bunch of people. And I got then an invitation to turn it into a blog, which was a very healthy thing because I had to reduce it to 1,500 words, which is not always an easy thing to do. And then this blog got published, and I think it is probably the most widely read thing that I've ever written. So it's a little bit of a surprise to me that this is what you have to do to get people to read your work, but I think that it has stimulated quite a bit of healthy discussion in the community, and it's starting to have some influence in that I've seen some program committees starting to try to experiment a little bit to see if there are ways to do things a little bit better. Now, I do want to say that, what I'm going to be talking about today is really a very personal view, and it's colored by a great deal of frustration. I mean, just 3 days ago, I got 2 more rejections from 2 papers that were actually on our 3rd try to get them accepted at different conferences. And so to some degree, you should take with a grain of salt what I say, because it's colored by I'm in a bad mood, let's say. And, this is partly because of this, fairly recent frustration. But there are people who have done some really more scientific studies of the subject, and I really like in particular this work by Nihar Shah at CMU, where this is kind of a meta study, and he points to actually a great deal of research into the whole process of peer review. And I think that it's an area that I think is actually a very valid research area. It cross-cuts technology and society. And it surprised me, actually. I learned from Nihar about some of the ways that some of the larger computer science conferences are dealing with the explosion of volume in papers that they have to deal with, including using quite a bit of quite sophisticated technology that has some interesting consequences in how the whole reviewing process happens. So, put this against a backdrop of enormous pressure that people in academia have these days to publish. And it's one of the things that I have learned is that in various parts of the world, it's becoming mandatory for people to publish a certain amount. In China, for example, there are rules in various institutions that you have to publish a certain amount before you can even be considered for certain advancements in rank. In Korea, there are some institutions that require publications in peer-reviewed venues in order to get a degree. So this is creating quite a number of problems, particularly when you combine that with the rather capricious nature of peer review as it has turned into in computer science. So I'm going to stop screen sharing and just go PowerPointless here and talk to you directly and talk to you about a few of the issues that I've encountered. So I don't know how many of you are in computer science, so it's probably worth setting the stage here. But one of the things that is a bit different in computer science than many other academic disciplines is that the predominant publication venues are actually conferences rather than journals. That's not true in all areas of computer science. So for example, in theoretical computer science, journals still play a huge role. But in most of the branches of computer science, the places that you strive to publish in are conferences. And conferences have a number of issues compared to journals. One is they typically have hard deadlines. And often you'll see research groups that are, just entirely focused on addressing these deadlines and getting papers submitted to these conferences. A second thing is that there's really no opportunity for dialogue with reviewers. So you frequently get reviews where it's clear the reviewer really didn't understand the paper at all, and you don't have a chance. Nominally, these conferences, some of them offer the opportunity to submit a rebuttal, but the rebuttal is typically limited to 500 words or something, and it's impossible to actually respond to the reviewer's comments in 500 words. And in my experience, the rebuttals have never had an effect of changing a decision on a paper. And so you can usually tell when you get the first round of reviews, even if they don't tell you whether the paper's going to be accepted or rejected, you know already, and the rebuttal isn't really going to change things. In constructing rebuttals, I had an experience recently where out of frustration, I was more aggressive than I should be in the rebuttal, and the paper was rejected out of hand without even further consideration because of my lack of respect for the reviewers. And in retrospect, the criticism was in fact valid. The reviewers are also under an enormous amount of pressure. In computer science, serving on a program committee is really a yeoman's task. It's a task that you don't get a huge amount of reward for, and you get barraged with this very sudden influx of sometimes 10, 12, 15 papers, and you've got 10 days to read them, and they're very technical. And it's extremely difficult to do. I have done this many times, and it's exhausting, it's tiring, and no matter how hard you try, you're going to make a lot of mistakes in this process. And so when you send your rebuttals, try to understand, put yourself in the foot of the reviewers that they are people in your community who are also trying to make a contribution to the community, and they're in some sense, victims of the same process that you're being victimized by. The biggest problem, I think, in the current process in computer science is the low acceptance rates at the leading conferences. In fact, the conferences seem to compete with one another for the lowest acceptance rates. There's these ranking services that rank conferences primarily on the basis of low acceptance rates, which I personally find to be an abomination, right? I mean, the conferences should be ranked on the basis of the impact of the papers, not on the low acceptance rate. And The IEEE even requires IEEE sponsored conferences to have acceptance rates lower than 50%. And so, the problem with this is that low acceptance rates, I mean, many of the conferences have 20%, sometimes 10% acceptance rates. And that's valid if you assume that there's a lot of charlatans writing papers and submitting them. But in my experience, that's not the case. I've served on program committees where I get an entire stack of papers where every paper is a serious effort by smart people. And every paper is flawed. There's no such thing as a perfect paper. And a reviewer often sees flaws that are actually not real. They're not actually flaws in the paper. They're flaws in they're gaps in the reviewer's ability to interpret what's being said in the paper. And reviewers will often come across as very assertive about flaws that they've identified, which are not really flaws. And that can be very frustrating to authors. But these low acceptance rates are, really problematic. Why do we have them? I think one of the reasons is because the conferences are trying to appear selective. Okay, and I think when you get down to 10% acceptance rates, unless you're really getting a lot of charlatan submissions, you're not being selective, you're being random. And you're choosing a random subset of the submitted papers. And that really is not, I think, a valid criterion for deeming a conference to be somehow more valuable than some other conference. So maybe they're selective because there isn't enough room in the venue, in the publication venue for presentation of all of the papers. But that's actually not really justifiable either, because conferences have shown that you can actually scale up quite effectively. You can scale up using poster sessions. You can scale up using lightning talks, followed by discussion sections. And the fact is that, it used to be that actually publishing the proceedings of conferences was rather expensive. And you had a limited number of pages in the budget that you could pay for publishing the proceedings. But that's no longer the case. So that doesn't justify by itself low acceptance rates. And one of the other phenomena that I see is that the low acceptance rates are actually a kind of a self-reinforcing phenomenon, because researchers who have genuine results, good things to report, have to find themselves having to submit 3 or 4 times to conferences. And so instead of getting, 3 reviews for your paper, you get a dozen reviews for your paper before it gets accepted, which is a, 4 times increase on the load on the overall reviewing load on the community. And so the low acceptance rates are actually forcing more low acceptance rates, because they're simply increasing the total number of paper submissions, because the papers get repeatedly submitted to subsequent conferences. Some of the larger conferences are doing some pretty interesting innovations to try to manage the process. One of the difficulties in a large conference is matching up reviewers with papers, right, that the reviewers are competent to review. And some of these conferences are actually using language models and AI-driven matching algorithms to try to do this. And I've heard of a few cases of people trying to cheat this system. So you can do simple techniques like you can embed into your PDF large amounts of text that are completely invisible to a human. For example, they might be a white font on white background in the margins of your document. And you can use these to guide the review process, and no human sees them, but these large amounts of text might use keywords that will drive the paper towards certain reviewers that you think might be favorable to your paper. So those kinds of things, there's this sort of arms race happening in the use of technology for getting papers accepted. Another trick that I've seen people do is to really optimize their citations. So if you're going to submit to a particular conference and you have a pretty good idea of which part of the program committee is likely to be reviewing your paper, then you optimize your related work section to cite the program committee members. And that's going to make them, it's going to bias them to make them a little bit more likely to accept your paper. And in fact, I predict that it will be before long pretty easy to use an AI to do this. You can take your paper with no related work section, upload it to ChatGPT, give it the names of the program committee, and ask it to write a related work section that cites those papers from the program committee in a positive way, okay? And then just paste that into your related work section, and it's going to improve your acceptance rate. These kinds of things are happening. I mean, not that one particularly, I don't know for a fact is happening, but I know for a fact it's totally doable. We've seen the technology to do this. I hope none of you are going to be the ones who are going to run with it and do this because I suggested it, but I think it's inevitable. And I think that it's a direct consequence of this culture of low acceptance rates. So I think one of the consequences of these low acceptance rates is that the program committees are given a charter that is a really unfortunate charter. They're given a stack of 15 papers and asked to find reasons to reject these papers because we want a 10% acceptance rate or we want a 20% acceptance rate. That's really unfortunate for a community, right? It's about looking for flaws in the work of your peers, as opposed to looking for the gems in the work of your peers. I think a community is much healthier when you look for the reasons to accept rather than the reasons to reject. And in fact, computer science is notorious for being harsh on itself. Someone did a study of National Science Foundation proposals in the United States. So the National Science Foundation funds work in a wide variety of scientific areas, including computer science. And the nominal rating on a proposal is from 1 to 5, and 5 is, you know, I'm very enthusiastic about this proposal. It really must be funded. And 1 is absolutely NSF should not consider this proposal. It's no good at all. And this study showed that in computer science, the reviews were on the scale of 1 to 5, on average, 0.4 lower in computer science than in all other science disciplines. 0.4 is pretty large, given the fact that, you know, pretty much no proposal with a rating lower than 4.5 gets funded. 0.4 is huge. And this is, you know, kind of a problem. I've heard from NSF you know, program managers that they form a panel and they get a large number of proposals in response to a solicitation, and the proposals all get rated very low by the panel. And the NSF program manager says, you know, I have no ammunition now to go to my higher ups to get more money for this program because the panelists are telling me we're just getting garbage proposals. And so if an area only draws garbage proposals, then, you know, there's not much incentive for the NSF to put more money, invest more money into that area, because if they can't get good proposals, they're not going to be a worthy investment. And I think that this low ranking of proposals is part of this culture of rejection that has emerged in computer science, where we're really, in effect, trying to tear each other down rather than trying to support each other. The other thing to consider is that paper rejections destroy careers. And I have seen people leave the field. I've seen people a little less drastic leave academia. Okay, they get a string of rejections on work that they think that they're really very enthusiastic about. They think it's really good, and maybe it really is very good, and they get a string of rejections. And the first step is they leave academia. They give up on this paper rat race is just not worth it. I don't have the stomach for this. I can't stand to get another rejection. But I've actually seen people leave computer science altogether because of this. And as a consequence, I think that this culture is really quite destructive to our community. And I think we really need to find a way to change it. Now, let me address particularly some of the reasons for rejection. And I think one of the most common ones is lack of novelty. Papers are deemed to be nothing new, right? A reviewer says, I didn't learn anything from reading this paper. And there's no new addition to the archive. One of the problems with this criterion is that I think that it's based on an archaic view of scientific progress. This archaic view, I think, was undermined after pretty extensive debate by the very controversial position that was very famously advocated by Thomas Kuhn when he published this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolution, in the 1970s. And the essential argument is that the archaic view of scientific progress is that the purpose of publication is to add to the archive of knowledge. So each publication should add something that is not already in the literature in order to grow this archive of knowledge. I don't think that's the way science progresses. And I think Thomas Kuhn argues very much better than I ever could that that is not the way science progresses. And I think that the purpose of publication is for dialogue between humans. It's for us to educate each other. And as a consequence, the papers we should be publishing are the ones that are interesting and informative, which may have absolutely nothing to do with novelty. Okay? It could be quite orthogonal to novelty. In fact, I wrote a whole book. My book called The Coevolution suggests that technology co-evolves with humans. It co-evolves with human culture in particular. And it's a Darwinian coevolutionary process. And in a Darwinian process, most novelty is deleterious. Okay? Most mutations, random mutations of a DNA lead to death of the individual. Okay, so novelty by itself is not actually a positive thing in a Darwinian process. And in fact, ideas that persist, that live on, that grow in a Darwinian process have to be reinforced with repetition and, minor twists and reinterpretation and dialogue over these ideas is what has to happen in order for the ideas to take hold. I mean, if you really insist on novelty, a good idea appears exactly once in the literature, is read by a very small number of people, and then obscured by the vast amount of literature and never seen again. That's not good for scientific progress. These things need to be repeated. And the purpose of publication is dialogue between humans. We're not writing for the AIs to read our papers. We're writing for humans to read our papers. And as a consequence, I think that this overemphasis on adding to the archive of facts is just profoundly misguided. And it's also driven by a historical fact that it used to be that publishing papers was very expensive. And therefore, every time you published a paper, you prevented another paper from being published because there simply wasn't enough budget for that. We're not in that scenario anymore. Okay, we're in a very different scenario where the primary value is the bandwidth of the humans. And as a consequence, a paper that is novel, that adds some little epsilon improvement, 5% increment on the efficiency of this algorithm, that has value for sure. Does it need to be presented in front of an audience of 80 people at a conference? Probably not, right? It's of interest to a very small number of people who are the ones that are, focused on that particular algorithm, and our search algorithms for papers have gotten good enough that nobody needs to present this for this to be findable. right? That kind of paper is a very good candidate for, say, a lightning talk at a conference, so that there's a broader knowledge of the existence of a result, okay? But the kinds of papers that should be getting presented at conferences are not necessarily the ones that are novel, but rather the ones that are informative, the ones that are of value to the community, so that people walk out of the room understanding something they didn't understand before, not because it's new, but because it's new to them, right? None of us knows but a tiny fraction of our discipline. And the vast majority of what any of us could tell each other will be novel to the other, okay? And so this absolute emphasis on novelty, I think, is really profoundly misguided. So a second criterion that is often used for rejection is obviousness. One of the problems with that criterion is that it really discourages writing papers that are easy to read. In fact, there have been, the paper that I pointed to earlier points to some very nice studies that shows that you can take a collection of statements that all say the same thing, okay? Have some of them say it very clearly using simple words, and have some of them say it in very obscure, fancy vocabulary, fancy sentence structure. And reviewers will deem the obscure statements to be more sophisticated, less obvious, and they'll rank them higher than the clearer statements. So, I mean, I advise my graduate students to, the submitted paper, don't write it for clarity of reading. Instead, go ahead, write in the fanciest way. Use mathematical notation extremely much instead of words, okay? And then when your paper gets accepted, rewrite that and say it in words so that it is now understandable to the reader, okay? Because you're actually, unfortunately, more likely to get your paper accepted if it is obscure than if it is easily read. Another problem that we face, I think, in the community is double-blind reviewing. And double-blind reviewing came about for very good reasons, okay? There's been established studies that show that reviewers are biased, and there's various ways in which they are biased, okay? One of the strongest ones in the studies that I've looked at is actually they're very much biased on by institution. So in fact, I think I benefited from this for much of my career, because most of my career only had single blind reviews, and my papers were coming from Berkeley, and they were favored. They were more likely to get a favorable review than papers coming from a lesser known institution. And so I think for most of my career, I actually benefited from this bias. Now, one of the problems is that if you think about why that bias is there, I don't think it's appropriate to think of it as malicious, okay? The fact is that the kinds of papers that reviewers are being asked to review in computer science are mostly really quite sophisticated papers. They can't check every detail. They might be faced with a 3-page proof that is just a dense piece of algebra, and they've got 12 other papers in their pile that they have to get through. They can't check it, okay? If the paper comes from a renowned individual who has a very strong reputation coming from a top institution, they might just trust the proof, okay, and move on. And that is, I think, a reason why such bias might creep in. Now, the problem now is that you remove that knowledge of who the individual is and who what institution they come from. Now the reviewer doesn't have the bandwidth to check the proof. They might be more inclined to reject just because they can't be sure, okay? So they don't want, an erroneous proof to creep in and, a bogus result, and they simply don't have the bandwidth to check all the details. And so they reject it. They say that that the proof is incomprehensible, and so I can't validate the results, and I think we should reject this. So double-blind reviewing in that sense can actually degrade the quality of the process. It does, there have been studies that show that there are gender biases when you don't do double-blind reviewing, and I think that that is a serious problem. So there's good reasons for the double-blind reviewing. I'm involved on a program committee now that is trying an interesting experiment that I'd like to see how it works, but they're gonna start out double-blind. So when the reviewers first review the paper and submit their draft review, they have no information about the authors. And then once those are submitted and recorded, the authors and institutions are revealed to the reviewers, and then there's a discussion among the program committee about the papers. I predict there's going to be a certain amount of chaos around this, where people are going to be pretty surprised about how much their minds change when they find out who the authors are. That's my prediction, but I don't know. We'll see. So the double-blind reviewing, I think, has certainly its valid reasons for being there, but I think we really need to try to innovate to try to mitigate its disadvantages. Another disadvantage that it has, which I think is one that is really hard to mitigate, is that when you're commenting on the work of an anonymous writer, I think it's human nature to be harsher. You don't think of this author as one of your friends. It might be one of your colleagues. It is a colleague in your community. It may well be someone you've met and talked to many times, right? But in your head, when you're reading this paper, it's a stranger. And it's much easier to be harsh to a stranger. And I think that's just human nature. And so I think reviewers will often write reviews that are really a lot harsher than they would write if there was a name associated with the author. Let's talk a little bit about the ethics of the process. Okay, let me start from the program committee side. So you're serving on a program committee, you're reviewing papers. Often in these conferences, you're reviewing papers for a conference that you yourself have submitted papers to. And the conference has a 20% acceptance rate. There's a natural tendency among the reviewers to be harsh because it will enhance the prospects for their own paper, which they're not involved in the reviewing of their own paper, right? So they don't have any say in that. But if their pile all gets rejected, then there's going to be a little more room for other papers, right? And so that creates a little bit of an ethical problem. There's a worse ethical problem, right? You submit a paper that is, a summary of the best things you've learned over the last 3 years. It's a phenomenal paper with really good results, and it gets reviewed by 3, 4, 5 reviewers who have no idea who you are. And they learn something from it. And maybe they claim they didn't learn something, because actually that's also human nature, right? In retrospect, things are obvious. When you're done reading the paper, you don't realize that you actually know something you didn't know before you started reading the paper, right? But you can't cite the work. And inevitably, the reviewers will go on and use what they've learned. And to me, this is highly unethical, right? That your work is being read by people who can't cite it and will use it. This phenomenon is actually exacerbated by a bidding process that is used in conferences, where you get to look at the titles and abstracts of all the papers that are submitted and choose which ones you'd like to review. Well, I always choose the ones that I expect to learn the most from, right? Those are the papers I like to read. Why wouldn't I pick those? And then those papers go and get rejected, and I inevitably have learned something from them, and I don't know who to cite. And I think that that's actually a foundational ethical problem in our process right now. Another problem is that reviewers currently in our process have no accountability. There's this veil of anonymity, and they can submit reviews, and after the conference is done, there's no record, there's no archival record of the reviews that are kept. And as a consequence, there's really no accountability. There's various conferences that have been experimenting with techniques where when a paper is published, the reviews get published and the rebuttals get published also. And there's experiments where authors that get papers rejected are given the option of publishing in an archival form the submitted paper, the reviews, and the rebuttal, okay, as a way of archiving this process. I think that those kinds of things we really should be experimenting with to try to increase the accountability on the reviewer side. On the author side, I think that I've already mentioned several problems that are really ethical problems, right? Obfuscating your paper to improve its chances of acceptance, citing members of the program committee to improve their chances of acceptance. These things are unethical also, and yet our process really encourages them. In the overall culture, I think that it's unethical how we are really squashing young minds. I see the pain in graduate students who, they put everything into it, and the reviews come back and the reviewers just didn't get it, okay? And they're crushed. And, many of them, I really admire their persistence. They just, brush it off, try to learn from it, try to improve the paper and resubmit to someplace else. But I think it's a brutal process, and to me it resembles something more like hazing than like selectivity. It's like joining a fraternity and having to go through some horrible hazing process to get into the fraternity. The other thing is that it really slows the progress of research. It's not uncommon for it to take you 3 years to get a conference paper published. One of the benefits of conferences, it was supposed to be quick turnaround, that you get your paper published quickly. The reality in computer science is, if you choose a conference as a venue, you're choosing probably a slower route than a journal. The journal is more likely to be published sooner than the conference. The other thing is that the process rewards luck and stubbornness. If you have a 10% acceptance rate and you get a paper accepted at this conference with a 10% acceptance rate, is that really a badge of honor? Or does that just mean you were lucky? You got your paper happened to be assigned to the reviewers who are relatively generous and not to the reviewers who are relatively harsh. With a 10% acceptance rate, I don't think it's a measure of quality that you got your paper accepted. I don't think it can be. And the other problem is that this high rejection rate floods the conferences with papers, because papers are getting resubmitted many, many times. And this is really increasing the difficulty of running a conference and getting a program committee to be willing to put in all that effort. So in summary, I think that one of the key things that we should change is that conferences should focus on accepting papers that are interesting and illuminating and valuable to the community. That's, novelty should be a consideration, but by no means the top one, okay? I think we need to rethink double-blind submissions and find ways of mitigating the downsides of double-blind submissions. I think that if you serve on a program committee, when you're reviewing papers, think of it as if every paper that you're reviewing was written by your sister or somebody close to you, okay? Think of it that way. And the comments that you write in response to this paper should be as if they should be things you would be willing to say to the person in face-to-face in person. Okay. And most people will be much more, generous and circumspect if they put themselves in that mindset. You have to overcome the anonymity of the authorship. And finally, this business of adding to the archive of facts. I think the archive of facts, its purpose is mostly for the future AIs, not for the future humans. And I think that the purposes of our conferences should really be for the humans, not for the AIs. So I think that requires a change of mindset. So with that, I'd like to open it up for discussion and comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a lot of food for thought, a lot to unpack, and I'm glad that we're having this conversation to shed light on it and to potentially move to a better future.